In the year 1325, across the rolling hills of northern Italy, two neighboring cities were about to plunge into a war so absurd, so seemingly trivial, that it would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. This wasn't a clash over vast territories or ancient bloodlines. This wasn't even about trade routes or marriage alliances. No, this was about something far more humble, something that would make historians scratch their heads for centuries to come. A simple wooden bucket. But before you dismiss this as just another petty medieval squabble, let me tell you something that will change how you see this entire conflict. The War of the Bucket wasn't really about a bucket at all. Hidden beneath this seemingly ridiculous tale lies one of the most bitter and destructive feuds in European history, a conflict that would reshape the political landscape of Italy and drag entire empires into its wake. This is the story of how a stolen pail became the symbol of a war that had been brewing for centuries, a war between two ideas of power that would tear apart the very fabric of medieval Europe. The stage for this incredible drama was set not in some distant battlefield, but in the heart of what we now call Italy. Picture, if you will, the Italy of the early 14th century. This was not the unified nation we know today, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, each one a miniature kingdom unto itself. From the marble palaces of Venice to the banking houses of Florence, from the papal states of Rome to the merchant republics of the north, Italy was a continent in miniature, where every city dreamed of empire and every ruler believed himself a Caesar. But this wasn't just about local politics. Oh no, this was about something far grander, far more consequential. For centuries, two great powers had been locked in a struggle that would define the very nature of authority in medieval Europe. On one side stood the Holy Roman Emperor, heir to Charlemagne's crown, claiming dominion over all of Christendom through divine appointment and ancient rite. On the other side rose the Pope, successor to St. Peter, wielding spiritual authority that he claimed extended into the temporal realm as well. This wasn't merely a political disagreement. This was a fundamental question about the nature of power itself. Who had the right to rule? Who could appoint bishops and control the vast wealth of the church? Should earthly kingdoms bow to spiritual authority, or should the church submit to imperial command? These questions had torn Europe apart since the 11th century, and by 1325, they had crystallized into two opposing factions that would make the Wars of the Roses look like a neighborhood dispute. They called themselves the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, names that carried the weight of centuries and the promise of blood. The Guelphs, champions of papal authority, believed that the church should guide the earthly realm, that spiritual power superseded temporal might. The Ghibellines, loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor, argued that imperial authority came directly from God, making the emperor the rightful ruler of Christian lands. These weren't just political parties, they were ideological armies, and every city, every noble family, every merchant guild had to choose a side. Now, imagine two cities, neighbors in the fertile plains of northern Italy, separated by barely 30 miles of countryside. Bologna, ancient and proud, had chosen the Guelph cause. Its citizens looked to Rome for guidance, its merchants funded papal armies, and its nobles swore fealty to the church's temporal claims. Just to the southeast lay Modena, smaller but no less fierce, a Ghibelline stronghold whose loyalty to the emperor burned as bright as the Italian Sunday. These weren't random choices. Bologna's allegiance to the Pope made perfect sense for a city that had grown wealthy through church patronage and papal favor. Its university, one of Europe's greatest centers of learning, had flourished under ecclesiastical protection. Its merchants had secured profitable contracts through papal connections. For Bologna, supporting the Guelphs wasn't just ideology, it was good business. Modena's loyalty to the emperor was equally practical. As a smaller city surrounded by larger rivals, Modena needed the protection that only imperial authority could provide. The Holy Roman Emperor might be distant, but his power was real, and his favor could mean the difference between prosperity and destruction. For Modena, the Ghibelline cause offered hope against the overwhelming influence of papal Bologna. But practical considerations were only part of the story. What really drove these cities toward conflict was something deeper, something that touched the very soul of medieval Italy. This was the age of the communes, when Italian cities had begun to taste the intoxicating wine of independence. After centuries of foreign domination, these urban centers had discovered they could govern themselves, make their own laws, wage their own wars. They had become miniature republics, each one jealously guarding its freedom, each one ready to fight anyone who threatened its autonomy. The investiture controversy had given these cities the perfect excuse to assert their independence. By choosing sides in the great struggle between Pope and Emperor, they could claim to be fighting for higher principles while actually pursuing their own interests. A city that declared itself Guelph could resist imperial taxation in the name of papal authority. A Ghibelline stronghold could ignore church demands by appealing to imperial privilege. It was the perfect system for ambitious city-states that wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Frederick Barbarossa had learned this lesson the hard way back in the 12th century. When the Holy Roman Emperor tried to reassert imperial control over northern Italy, the cities had banded together in the Lombard League, crushing his armies at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. The message was clear. Italy's cities would no longer bow meekly to foreign authority, whether that authority wore an imperial crown or a papal tiara. By 1325, this spirit of independence had created a powder keg. Every Italian city-state was armed, aggressive, and absolutely convinced of its own righteousness. Trade disputes became causes for war. Border disagreements escalated into military campaigns. Ancient grudges festered into generational hatred. The Guelph-Ghibelline conflict provided the perfect framework for every petty rivalry and territorial ambition that Italian politics could produce. Bologna and Modena embodied this toxic combination of ideological fervor and practical rivalry. They competed for the same trade routes, coveted the same territories, and harbored grudges that stretched back generations. Pope Boniface VIII had confirmed Bologna's seizure of the towns of Bazzano and Savigno from Modena in 1296, a humiliation that the Modenese had never forgotten and never forgiven. For nearly 30 years, this resentment had simmered beneath the surface of everyday politics. Raids and counter-raids became routine. Merchants were harassed, farms were burned, and border fortresses changed hands with depressing regularity. Each side told itself that it was defending higher principles, that it was fighting for the cause of Pope or Emperor, but the reality was simpler and more human. These cities hated each other with the passionate intensity that only neighbors can achieve. The spark that would ignite this centuries-old conflict came in June 1325, when Bolognese militiamen decided to have a little fun at Modena's expense. They plundered several farms in Modenese territory, burned the crops that represented months of peasant labor, and then, in an act of supreme contempt, fired crossbow bolts at the city walls of Modena itself. It was meant as a joke, a bit of harmless military theater designed to humiliate their Ghibelline rivals. The Modenese didn't find it amusing. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold. But in the blazing heat of that Italian summer, the Modenese had no patience for patience. Within days of the Bolognese insult, they struck back with surgical precision. The target was Monteveglio, a fortress that commanded the hills between the two cities, like a stone sentinel watching over the ancient Roman roads. This wasn't just any castle. This was Bologna's key to controlling the borderlands, the linchpin of their entire defensive strategy in the region. The Modenese didn't storm the walls or lay siege to the fortress. They did something far more elegant and infinitely more insulting. They bribed the commandant. One can only imagine the conversation, perhaps over wine in some shadowy tavern, as Modenese gold changed hands and the keys to Bologna's most important stronghold were quietly surrendered. By morning, the banner of Modena flew from Monteveglio's towers, and Bologna's military architects were left staring at maps that no longer made any sense. This was no longer a game. The capture of Monteveglio was a declaration of war written in stone and steel. Bologna's city council convened in emergency session, their voices echoing through marble halls as they debated their response. Some called for negotiation, others for immediate military action, but the choice had already been made for them. In medieval Italy, a city that allowed such an insult to go unanswered was a city that had signed its own death warrant. The drums of war began to beat across the Lombard plain. Bologna's citizens watched from their windows as messengers galloped through the streets, carrying orders to every allied city within 100 miles. The great bells of San Petronio tolled the call to arms, their bronze voices carrying across the countryside like thunder. This was no longer about territory or trade routes. This had become a matter of honor, and honor, in medieval Italy, was worth more than gold. But Bologna's leaders faced a problem that would have given nightmares to any military commander. Their city was wealthy, populous, and influential, but it was not a military powerhouse. The citizens who filled their militia ranks were merchants and craftsmen, men who knew more about profit margins than battle formations. They could field impressive numbers, certainly enough to overwhelm little Modena through sheer weight of force. But numbers meant nothing if those numbers couldn't fight. Across the disputed borderland, Modena was preparing for what should have been a hopeless struggle. Their population was a fraction of Bologna's, their treasury smaller, their political influence negligible. By every reasonable calculation, they were doomed. But Modena possessed something that Bologna lacked, something that would prove more valuable than all the gold in the Bolognese banks. They had professional soldiers. The man who would lead Modena to glory was Passerino Bonacolsi, a condottiero whose name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies across northern Italy. Bonacolsi was not a local noble playing at war for the sake of family honor. He was a professional, a man who understood that battles were won not by brave speeches or superior numbers, but by discipline, training, and tactical brilliance. Under his command stood not citizen soldiers dragged from their shops and counting houses, but German mercenaries whose trade was death and whose loyalty could be bought with silver. These were men who had learned their craft in the endless wars that plagued the Holy Roman Empire, veterans who had fought from the Baltic to the Alps. They moved like wolves, struck like lightning, and showed mercy only when it served their purposes. Against the amateur enthusiasm of Bologna's militia, they would prove as devastating as a winter storm. As autumn deepened into November, both armies began their final preparations. Bologna's forces swelled as contingents arrived from allied cities throughout Guelph, Italy. 30,000 foot soldiers answered the call, a host so vast that contemporary chroniclers compared it to the armies of ancient Rome. Add to this 2,500 mounted knights, the cream of Guelph nobility, and Bologna commanded a force that should have been unstoppable. The sight of this army on the march must have been magnificent and terrible. Banners snapped in the wind, displaying the heraldry of dozens of noble houses. Mail shirts glittered like scales in the autumn Sunday. The sound of their approach, the thunder of hooves and the tramp of marching feet, could be heard for miles across the peaceful countryside. Peasants fled to the hills, merchants locked their shops, and even hardened soldiers crossed themselves as this tide of steel and leather swept past their villages. Yet for all its impressive appearance, this was still fundamentally an amateur force. These men fought for their cities, for their beliefs, for their hatred of the Ghibellines, but they did not fight for a living. When the moment of crisis came, when discipline meant the difference between victory and slaughter, would their enthusiasm be enough? The Modenese army that prepared to meet this host was a David facing Goliath. 5,000 infantry and barely 2,000 cavalry against odds of more than 4 to 1. But Bonacolsi had chosen his ground carefully, and he had trained his men well. More importantly, he had devised a strategy that would turn Bologna's greatest strength, their overwhelming numbers, into their greatest weakness. On the morning of November 15th, 1325, the two armies faced each other across the fields near the village of Zappolino. The sun rose blood-red through the autumn mist, casting long shadows across ground that would soon be churned to mud by the feet of the dying. Priests moved among the ranks of both armies, offering final blessings and last rites to men who might not live to see sunset. The Bolognese deployed in the traditional manner, their vast numbers spread across the battlefield like a human sea. Their confidence was palpable. How could they lose? They outnumbered their enemies so completely that simple arithmetic seemed to guarantee victory. Some of their commanders were already planning the victory celebration, already composing the letters they would send to allied cities announcing their triumph. Bonacolsi watched this deployment with the cold eye of a professional killer. He saw not an unstoppable force, but a mob. He saw men who had never learned to hold formation under pressure, officers who had read about warfare in books but never felt the terror of a cavalry charge. Most importantly, he saw an opportunity. The plan he had devised was audacious to the point of madness. He would divide his already outnumbered force, sending part of his army to feint a river crossing while keeping his best troops in reserve for the decisive moment. It was the sort of gamble that could win a war or destroy an army completely. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to retreat and regroup. Victory or death, those were the only options left. As the morning mist began to burn away under the strengthening sun, both armies made their final preparations. Weapons were sharpened one last time, armor was checked and adjusted, and men who had been strangers days before clasped hands and swore brotherhood. The great game was about to begin, and before the day was over, the course of Italian history would be changed forever. The battle began not with the clash of steel, but with a deception so bold that it bordered on genius. As the sun climbed higher into the November sky, Bonacolsi put his desperate plan into motion. He ordered a portion of his forces to march toward the river crossing, their banners visible to every Bolognese scout, their intentions seemingly clear. To the watching enemy, it appeared that the Modenese were attempting to outflank them, to cross the water and attack from an unexpected angle. The Bolognese commanders took the bait like hungry fish. Convinced that they had discovered their enemy's strategy, they dispatched thousands of their troops to counter this perceived threat. The sight must have filled them with satisfaction. Here was proof of their tactical superiority, evidence that they could read the battlefield better than their Ghibelline opponents. They watched with growing confidence as their forces moved to block the river crossing, certain that they had anticipated every move their enemies might make. But Bonacolsi was counting on exactly this reaction. As the Bolognese army divided, as thousands of their best troops marched away from the main battle line, he prepared to spring his trap. The river crossing had been nothing but a phantom, a shadow cast by his imagination to confuse and mislead his opponents. Now, with the enemy forces scattered and confused, he would strike at their heart with the concentrated fury of his professional soldiers. The moment came without fanfare, without the dramatic speeches that poets would later invent. Bonacolsi simply raised his sword, and 2,000 German veterans began their advance. These were not the citizen soldiers of Bologna, fighting for ideology and civic pride. These were men who killed for wages, who measured their worth in the number of enemies they could cut down before sunset. They moved forward with the mechanical precision of a war machine, their formation tight, their purpose clear. The first collision was like the breaking of a dam. The Modenese cavalry, led by knights whose families had served emperors for generations, crashed into the Bolognese line with devastating force. Behind them came the infantry, their weapons thirsting for blood, their battle cries echoing across the battlefield like the howls of demons. The sound of that impact, steel against steel, flesh against iron, carried for miles across the autumn countryside. For the first few minutes, it seemed as if the sheer weight of numbers might save Bologna after all. Their militia, for all its amateur enthusiasm, fought with desperate courage. Men who had never held a sword in anger found reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. The Guelph banners held firm, their bearers dying where they stood, rather than yield ground to the hated Ghibellines. But courage without discipline is like fire without fuel. It burns bright and fierce for a moment, then gutters and dies. The Bolognese fighters, brave as they were, had never learned to maintain formation under the pressure of a sustained assault. They had never been taught to watch their flanks while engaging enemies to their front. Most critically, they had never experienced the soul-crushing terror of facing professional killers who showed no mercy and felt no fear. The German mercenaries cut through their ranks like reapers harvesting wheat. Every sword stroke was calculated, every thrust precisely aimed. They gave no quarter and asked for none, advancing step by bloody step over the bodies of their enemies. The Bolognese line began to bend under this relentless pressure, then crack, then finally shatter completely. What followed was not so much a battle as a massacre. The retreat that began as an orderly withdrawal quickly degenerated into a panicked flight. Men threw away their weapons to run faster. Noble knights abandoned their horses and fled on foot. The banners that had flown so proudly that morning now lay trampled in the mud, their silk and gold reduced to bloody rags. Bonacolsi pressed his advantage with ruthless efficiency. His cavalry pursued the fleeing Bolognese across the countryside, cutting down stragglers and preventing any attempt to regroup. The roads leading back to Bologna became rivers of blood, littered with the bodies of men who had left their homes that morning confident of victory, and now would never return to embrace their wives and children. The battle lasted barely 2 hours, but those 2 hours changed everything. When the sun reached its zenith, the field of Zappolino lay silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the cries of scavenging birds. Of the mighty host that Bologna had assembled, barely half would ever see their city again. 2,000 men lay dead or dying in the autumn mud, their dreams of glory transformed into food for ravens. For Modena, the victory was so complete, so unexpected, that it seemed almost supernatural. Against odds that should have guaranteed their destruction, they had not merely survived but triumphed. The professional soldiers who had won this impossible victory began the grim work of collecting spoils, stripping armor from the dead, gathering weapons that would serve them in future campaigns. But for their leaders, material gain was not enough. This victory demanded something more, something that would echo through the ages. The pursuit that followed was as devastating as the battle itself. The Modenese army, drunk on victory and thirsting for revenge, followed the fleeing Bolognese all the way to the walls of their city. Behind them, they left a trail of destruction that would be remembered for generations. The castles of Crespellano, Zola, Samoggia, Anzola, Castelfranco, and Piomazzo, proud strongholds that had guarded Bologna's approaches for centuries, were reduced to smoking ruins. But the greatest humiliation was yet to come. As the shattered remnants of Bologna's army cowered behind their city walls, the victorious Modenese did something that cut deeper than any sword thrust. They organized a palio, a festival of games and competitions, right outside the gates of the defeated city. It was an insult so profound, so deliberately crafted to inflict maximum psychological damage, that it would be remembered long after the military details of the battle had been forgotten. Picture the scene. Bologna's citizens, peering fearfully from their windows and battlements, forced to watch as their enemies celebrated in the very shadow of their walls. The Modenese had not come as conquerors seeking to occupy the city. They had come as victors asserting their dominance, proving that they could do whatever they pleased, while their enemies could only watch in helpless rage. The games themselves were a masterpiece of calculated contempt. Every event, every competition, every moment of celebration was designed to remind the watching Bolognese of their complete and utter defeat. Here were the men who had crushed their armies, destroyed their castles, and humiliated their city, and they were treating the whole affair as entertainment, as a source of amusement, rather than the deadly serious business of war. 26 of Bologna's most prominent citizens had been captured during the rout, noble families whose names were written in the city's founding documents. These men, pillars of Bolognese society, were marched through the streets of Modena in chains, their humiliation a public spectacle that drove home the completeness of their city's defeat. For 11 weeks they would remain in Modenese dungeons, 11 weeks during which their families would count every dawn wondering if this would be the day they received news of execution. Yet even this was not enough to satisfy Modena's appetite for revenge. As the palio reached its climax, as the last competitions were completed and the final insults delivered, the Modenese soldiers performed one final act that would give this war its name and its place in history. They approached a well that stood near the Porta San Felice, one of Bologna's ancient gates, and with deliberate ceremony, they removed its wooden bucket. It was such a small thing, barely worth noticing under normal circumstances. Just a simple oaken pail, the sort of humble object that could be found in any Italian city. But in that moment, in that place, surrounded by the smoke of burning castles and the echoes of military triumph, it became something far more significant. It became a symbol, a tangible representation of Bologna's defeat and Modena's victory. The bucket was carried back to Modena in triumph, displayed like a trophy won in single combat. The citizens who lined the streets to welcome their victorious army cheered not just for the soldiers who had won an impossible battle, but for this simple wooden vessel that had become the emblem of their city's greatest hour. It was placed in the Torre della Ghirlandina, the great bell tower that dominated Modena's skyline, where it could be seen by every citizen, every visitor, every diplomatic envoy who came to the city. And so the War of the Bucket became something far greater than the sum of its parts. What began as a dispute between two Italian cities evolved into a symbol of the eternal human capacity for turning the profound into the petty, and the petty into the profound. That humble wooden pail still sits in Modena's tower today, a testament to how the smallest objects can carry the weight of history's greatest passions. The next time someone tells you a conflict is too insignificant to matter, remember the bucket that started a war and ask yourself, what empires might crumble over something equally small?